Hi everyone. Of late, I have been working on a portrait basic series, and I have started with do's and don'ts of painting noses, followed by lips, eyes, and the ears. But so far, I have worked with oils and acrylics only. Now, I understand that watercolor is a completely different beast, so today we are going to discuss do's and don'ts of painting eyes, nose, and mouth with watercolors. I will start off with the don'ts. So on the left side of the face, I am going to show about the common mistakes people make when they are starting off painting portraits with watercolor. So the don'ts of eyes, nose, and mouth. So as you can see that I'm starting on by putting in some skin tone, and this is quite basic that you need to start on with the basic skin tone first. For watercolors, it is important to understand that there is a certain amount of things that you need to understand, that some things work better when you work wet on wet and some things work better when you work on dry surfaces. So that is an understanding with watercolor that you need to come on with. Now, starting with the eyes, you can see that on the don't side, what I'm doing is I'm just creating an outline and painting solid blocks of colors. Common mistake: eyes are not spindle shapes objects with two pointy ends. The inside end of the eye has a tear gland, the lacrimal gland, and that is why that end is more like an almond's looks more like an almond. So the eye is shaped more like an almond and does not have two pointy ends. Second common mistake: you can see that what I have created here is blocks of paints for eyebrows, blocks of paints for iris, and very clean broad outlines. That is not what you need to do. There are no outlines. The darks and lights are created by gradation of lights and shadows and not by outlines, not in the nose, not in the eyes, not in the mouth, not in anywhere in the face. This is something that you would want to do if you want to get a cartoon look or a comic manga, or if you're trying to do a more expressionist style, then yes, this is fine, outlines are fine. But if you are drawing if you're attempting to do a realistic portrait, which what I am trying to demonstrate right here, then outlines are not okay. Do not make straight up lines. Now going on to the do side of the painting of the face, and let's start with the eyes. You can see that I have just put on a layer of skin tone, and while the skin tone is still wet, I'm adding in some shadows where I want my shadows to be. Shadows, since it needs blending, so it is better to work wet on wet so that it does not create harsh lines. So if you don't want harsh lines, if you don't want your lines to stay true, then you want to work wet on wet while you're working with watercolors. And obviously with watercolors, it is always a better idea to start with the lightest color and slowly build up your darks. It is very easy to get to the darker colors, but not so easy to get to the lighter colors with watercolors. Obviously, you can use ink and gouache or any opaque sort of paint on top of watercolors. But if you want to learn watercolors really well, working from light to dark is one rule that you cannot avoid. So you can see that all this while that I have paint blocked in the eyebrows and eyes or iris of the eye, I have done some solid colors, but I'm gradually adding in darks and lights and shadows, and it is just not one block of color. Neither I have created outlines. The outlines that have happened is by adding color on top of color on top of color. Now, in case of eyebrows, I started with painting the whole base with the skin tone itself, because obviously under the eyebrow hair there is skin. So you want to start with the skin tone and then slowly build up layers of hair and not one solid block of color, because the eyebrows is not like a painted thing. It has got strands of hair, and the hair you have to think of them as clumps and clusters and not as single strands. Same with the eyelashes. Think of them as more like clumps and clusters, and not like every single strand has to be prominent. And eyelashes, both upper and lower, are almost always curved lines and not straight lines, and they almost always point out towards the outer side of the face and not towards just up and down. So pay attention to your reference photo. That is another thing I would really recommend when you're starting off painting portraits in the realistic style. Use a reference photo. You might have seen eyes and noses and mouths all your life, but seeing one thing is very different from actually painting it. When you go and try to paint it, you would realize that it is always better to use a reference photo if your goal is to paint in realistic style. Now you can see that I'm adding more darker areas on top of dry base in the eyes, and making the eyelashes more prominent, adding shadows underneath the eye. This is one thing I also want to highlight, that the iris of the eye, the pupil of the eye, is almost always, unless the person is shocked and the pupils are dilated, almost always half of it is covered by the upper eyelid. So you want to make sure that the whole circle is not prominent, but you would rather want to go with a half circle, semicircle, or a semicircle that is a little bit big on the bigger side. So that is another important thing I wanted to mention. And now moving on to the nose. Again, you can see that I have hardly created any lines over here. The only line or harsh line that I would leave on the nose will be on the lower edge of where I will draw out the nostrils. That is the darkest area of the nose, and that is the only place where I will leave an outline. And nowhere else in the nose will I will have an actual outline. It will be darks and lights and shadows, and all my shadows will mostly be a gradual transition of colors and not a straight line. Also, sometimes it is important in case of watercolors to subtract some colors and not just keep on adding in. Like I said, it is always easier to go from light to dark in watercolor, but sometimes, like you can see in case of the nose, around the nostril areas, while the paint was still wet, I lifted out some of the colors to show the lights and darks and appropriately. So that is one more thing that you need to understand with watercolors, that not only should you keep on adding colors, but sometimes you need to subtract some colors as well. You can see that I am trying to get rid of all the harsh lines by working wet on wet. Now moving on to the lips. First thing I do is paint the whole lip area with the general skin color. Lips are more or less the same color as our face is. It's just because more blood vessels and capillaries work through the area of the lips. Sometimes it is a tad bit more reddish or pinkish, but it is more or less the same color and not a very bright red or pink color, which people generally tend to make it, unless obviously the person is wearing makeup on the lips. Same with the lips with outlines. Unless the person is wearing a lip liner and outline the lips, there is no outlines. It is just a transition of darks and lights. And almost in all cases, the upper lip is a little bit more protruded than the lower lip, which can vary obviously from person to person, and so can all the facial features depending on the race, on gender, on the age of the person. But the lights and darks typically for the lips would be, the darkest area would be in between the two lips, the crease of the lips. Those would be the darkest area. And then you want to add some shadows in between the lip and the nose, right underneath the middle of the nose and on top of the chin and in between the lips. These are the areas that are further indented on the face. So a general rule of thumb in painting faces is that the areas that are indented will have darker shadows or darker colors than the areas that are protruding out. So like the chin or the nose will have a light, or the tip of the nose or the tip of the chin will have a lighter, or rather a lighter shade than maybe the inside of the nostrils or underneath the eyelids. Also, one more thing I wanted to highlight while painting eyes, make sure that you add the shadow of the eyelid underneath the eyelid, the top eyelid that I mean. Now you can see that I'm adding a little bit of hair. Now I'm not trying to teach you how to paint hair. That is a different thing altogether that I will handle in a different tutorial. I'm just adding a little bit of color in the hair area to make you understand how the face is framed by the hair and to get a feel of how a realistic portrait should look like. That is why I'm painting just blocks of color for hair and neck area on both the do's and don'ts side. And like I'm saying, that I'm not trying to teach you how to paint the entire portrait, and this is definitely not an example of the best portrait ever. If you want to watch me painting portraits, I have several other portrait painting videos in my portrait playlist that is linked below in the video description that you can check out. But this is not an example of the perfect portrait painting. This is just a tutorial to learn the basics of what you should not do and what you rather should do while painting faces, especially in case of the eyes, nose, and mouth. And once again, this is a front view. The side views would be very different. So that is the end of the tutorial where I show you the do's and don'ts of painting the face with watercolors. Give me a like if you like it, and thank you for watching.